Hello, everyone. There are more people coming in. Please have a seat. We're just about to begin. So hello again, my name is Andrei Baikov, and you haven't come to see me. I would like to introduce to you our honored guest. It's Professor John Mearsheimer. For those of you who missed his first talk on Monday, I'd like to give a brief introduction, very brief because most of you are aware of the credentials of Professor John Mearsheimer. Right, so Dr. John Mearsheimer is the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science of the University of Chicago. He was trained at West Point from 1966 to 1970, and he earned his master's degree in the University of Southern California and his PhD in the Cornell University. He's been working at the University of Chicago since 1982. He's well known as the main proponent of and the author of the offensive realism strand within the School of Political Science of Political Realism. He's written scores of influential articles and books, just to name only a few: Conventional Deterrence, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, The Israel Lobby and the US Foreign Policy, and Why Leaders Lie, The Truth About Lying in International Politics. He's given already 2 talks at MGIMO University, one on why China cannot rise peacefully, the other one, the Middle Eastern policy of the US, and today is going to be about the Ukraine crisis. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you ask your provocative questions. Please be advised that Professor Mearsheimer will have to leave straight after the end of the lecture, so please pose your questions very briefly, be to the point, so that as many people as possible can ask their questions. Thank you very much, and please join me in welcoming Professor John Mearsheimer.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Thanks to everybody for coming out. It's amazing to think that I've given 3 successive lectures, and in each case, the lecture hall has gotten bigger and bigger. And I'm actually honored that so many people would turn out on a Friday evening to hear me speak. The subject, of course, is the causes and consequences of the Ukraine crisis. And the way I'd like to proceed is I'd like to make a number of preliminary comments, and then I'd like to talk about what I think are the causes of the conflict, and then talk about what is the conventional wisdom on what caused this crisis between the United States and Russia, or Russia and the West more generally. And as almost all of you know, I believe that the conflict was mainly caused by Western policy, not by the actions of Putin or Russia more generally, which is the conventional wisdom, at least in the West. Then I'd like to talk about the West's response to the crisis and its inadequacies, and then what should be done, and then what are the consequences of this crisis. So that's the order in which I'll proceed. Let me start off with some comments about this subject. This is a radioactive subject. I've dealt with a lot of different security issues over the years, and there are not many issues that are as controversial, certainly in the West, but I think between the West and Russia, as the Ukraine crisis and the question of who's responsible for it. In the West, if you blame the United States and its allies, you're accused of defending Putin, and it's almost like you're unpatriotic. So it's almost a no-no for any American or European to argue that the Russians did not cause the Ukraine crisis. I would argue that there are probably 3 or 4, maybe 4 or 5 other people in the United States who share my views on what caused this crisis. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that it's just politically incorrect, if not politically intolerable in the West, to argue that the West is largely responsible for the crisis. I think the argument that people like me are defending Putin is a foolish argument. I think it's very important that we understand who is responsible for causing this problem. And who is responsible is largely determined by examining the facts. There's a certain set of facts surrounding this crisis. And what you have to do for yourself is you have to examine the facts. And you have to see whether you think my argument is correct or whether you think the conventional wisdom is correct. I personally believe that this is an open shut case. It's one of the simplest cases I've ever seen. I think it's unequivocally clear, at least in my mind, that the West is responsible for causing this crisis. The second thing I'd like to do is I'd like to lay out the basic geopolitical map that I have in my head about this crisis. This is a map that helps me think about the Ukraine crisis. This is a map of Europe today, pretty straightforward map. But to make sense of that map and think about European security, I think this is a good way to conceptualize the issue. I start with France on the far left, go to Germany, go to Poland, go to Ukraine, and go to Russia. When you think about security in Europe, those are the 5 countries that matter the most. And in modern times, the 2 countries that have mattered the most for European security are Germany and Russia, which is why they're outlined in red. And what matters really greatly is what countries are between Germany and Russia, or whether or not there are any countries between Russia and Germany. You all know that before World War I in 1914, there was no Ukraine, independent Ukraine, there was no independent Poland, and Russia and Germany abutted each other. That was not true before World War II. So it's very important to think about Germany on one hand and Russia on the other hand, and what's in between. And much of the thinking about the Ukraine crisis revolves around that basic geographical schema. Okay, let me now turn to the causes of the conflict. And I'm going to give you John's view on what caused the Ukrainian crisis. First of all, you have to talk about the deep causes. What are the underlying causes behind this situation? Then you have to talk about the precipitating cause. What caused the crisis to happen in February of 2014? And then finally, we have to talk about the Russian reaction. So what I'm going to do, in terms of laying out my views on the causes of the conflict, is talk about the deep cause, the precipitating cause, and the Russian reaction. Starting with the deep cause. My argument is that the deep cause of the crisis was the aim of the United States and its European allies to peel Ukraine away from the Soviet orbit and incorporate it into the West. And this policy actually had 3 dimensions to it: NATO expansion, EU expansion, and fostering an orange revolution. And as you all know, when I say fostering an orange revolution, I'm talking about promoting democracy in Ukraine. So the strategy that the West comes up with for peeling Ukraine away from Russia's orbit has 3 elements, and these are the 3 elements. And what we want to do is go through each one of those elements, starting, of course, with NATO expansion, which I think is the most important of the 3. Sorry. Here's a map of the eastward expansion of NATO. NATO expansion becomes a hot topic in the United States in the mid-1990s. It's the Clinton administration that's in the White House, and the Clinton administration is very interested in NATO expansion. There's huge opposition to it inside the United States at the time, but those in favor of expansion win. And the first tranche of expansion takes place in 1999. And as a result of that tranche, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary are admitted to NATO. That's the first tranche. It's important to understand that the Soviets made it clear that they were adamantly opposed to that expansion. Then there's another expansion in 2004. And if you look at the map, you'll see that that expansion includes the 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, and Slovakia. They all come in 2004. The Soviets complain bitterly about that second tranche, but they don't do anything. Then, very importantly, you have the Bucharest Summit in April of 2008. And at the end of that summit, a communique is issued which says, NATO welcomes Ukraine's and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership in NATO. And here's the killer sentence. We agreed today that these countries will become members of NATO. How do the Russians react? Russia's deputy foreign minister says, Georgia's and Ukraine's membership in the alliance is a huge strategic mistake, which will have most serious consequences for pan-European security. The Russians, after the Bucharest summit, are talking much differently about NATO expansion than they were with regard to the 1999 and 2004 expansions. And that's, of course, because you're marching right up to Russia's doorstep with Ukraine and Georgia being admitted. Putin's response to the Bucharest Declaration is Georgia and Ukraine becoming part of NATO is a direct threat to Russia. This is Putin speaking in 2008. It is no accident, ladies and gentlemen, that in August of 2008, a few months after the Bucharest summit, you have the Russo-Georgian War. The Georgians, thinking that they're eventually going to join NATO and thinking that countries like the United States will back them, begin to get aggressive in their ambitions vis-a-vis integration into the Western Alliance. What happens is a war breaks out and the Georgians lose, and the United States and the West Europeans do nothing to help Georgia. This is the first piece of evidence of what the consequences were going to be of the Bucharest Declaration. Let's talk about the second element of NATO expansion, second element of the Western strategy for dealing with Ukraine, EU expansion. There was a proposed association agreement on the table in 2013. And I'll talk more about this as we go along. This is an association agreement between the EU and Ukraine. The basic name of the game here is not to integrate Ukraine into the EU right away. It's not the game here. It's to start that process with the association agreement. The ultimate aim, of course, is to bring Ukraine into the EU. But the association agreement is to get the ball rolling. The EU has no interest in cooperating with Russia over Ukraine's economic future. This is a very, very important part of the story. Putin actually was not adamantly opposed to the association agreement, provided the Russians were included in the negotiations. Putin said that Russia has deep-seated economic interests in Ukraine. It has powerful economic ties with Ukraine. And if Ukraine is going to negotiate a profoundly important economic agreement with the EU that might eventually lead to integration into the EU, it was imperative that Russia's interests be considered, and therefore that Russia be involved in the negotiations. He made that proposal to the EU, and the EU dismissed it out of hand on more than one occasion. And the Russians were basically told to go packing, and that Ukraine and EU would negotiate this association agreement. Not surprisingly, the Russians saw the EU's actions as a geopolitical threat. This is not simply an economic threat. They saw it as a geopolitical threat. The association agreement, very importantly, contains important geopolitical rhetoric. It's not just about economics. In fact, if you read certain sections of the of the association agreement, it looks like this agreement is a Trojan horse for NATO expansion. So the Russians were very wary about EU expansion. So you see what you have going on here. You have NATO expansion taking place at the same time EU expansion is taking place. And EU expansion not only has significant economic consequences for the Russians, it also is linked to the geopolitical dimension, which is the NATO dimension. Third dimension is fostering an orange revolution. It's important to understand that the US is deeply committed to spreading democracy all around the globe, including in places like Russia. Most of you, I'm sure, heard me talk yesterday about US Middle East policy, and you remember the emphasis that I put on regime change. The United States was deeply committed to regime change in the Middle East. The United States is not only committed to regime change in the Middle East, it's concerned with regime change all over the planet. And it was deeply interested in regime change in Ukraine. The two dimensions of democracy promotion that you want to keep in mind are one, ideological, and two, geopolitical. The United States has an ideological commitment to liberal democracy. Americans believe that liberal democracy is the most favorable political order on the planet. And it would be really good from an ideological point of view if we could spread liberal democracy here, there, and everywhere. At the same time, there's a geopolitical dimension. And the geopolitical dimension goes like this. If we can topple regimes and put democratically elected leaders into power, they will invariably be pro-Western. So when the United States is interested in fostering an orange revolution in Ukraine or a rose revolution in Georgia, it is very important that you understand that they were not just putting someone into power who they couldn't be sure would like the United States or like Russia. They were putting in someone in power who they were quite confident would be pro-American. That's why we like democracy. And the underlying assumption, of course, is that one liberal Democrat's going to like another liberal Democrat. This is the argument that underpins democratic peace theory. Sometimes, as you know, the United States ends up dealing with a liberal democracy or a democracy that has a leader in charge who doesn't like the United States. And you know what the United States does in those cases? We overthrow the leader, even though he's democratically elected. We have a rich history of that. 1953 in Iran, 1954 in Guatemala, 1973 in Chile. I could go on and on. The United States has a rich history of overthrowing democratically elected leaders, because if those leaders don't dance to our tune, you're out of here. But our basic assumption is that we can put people in power through elections who'll be pro-American. So when you start talking about what we were doing in Ukraine, we were trying to foster democracy and put in power pro-American leaders. That's what the Orange Revolution is all about. Okay. There's the deep cause. Three elements: NATO expansion, EU expansion, and fostering an orange revolution. Causes of the conflict, in my view. I'm back to the basic architecture. I've given you the deep cause. Now we want to talk about the precipitating cause. The deep cause does not tell you why the crisis broke out in February of 2014. February 22nd, 2014. Why did it break out in February of 2014? What happened to cause the crisis at that particular point in time? Again, the deep cause can't tell you that story. So we want to talk about the precipitating cause, and then we'll go to the Russian response. The precipitating causes, it's a pretty simple story. The Ukrainian president at the time, this is Yanukovych, rejected an agreement with the EU. This is the association agreement that was being worked out. He rejected it in November 2013. And lots of people in Ukraine were outraged. And that led to demonstrations on the Maidan. And I'll talk a bit more about this in a second, but over time those demonstrations escalated. And then on February 22nd, 2014, this is a few months after the trouble starts in late November 2013, a coup takes place in Kiev, and Yanukovych is basically overthrown, and he leaves for Russia. That's the precipitating causes. Let me now lay out the story in more detail. November 21st is when Yanukovych says no to the EU deal. December 1st, a couple weeks later, large demonstrations start on the Maidan. December 17th, Putin announces a $15 billion loan to Ukraine, which Yanukovych accepts. See, what's happening here is Putin is offering Ukraine a better deal. The Putin deal is a better deal. And number two, Putin is putting extensive pressure on Yanukovych not to accept the association agreement. And he, of course, on November 21st, rejects it. So Yanukovych rejects it, Putin offers him a better deal. But already the protests have started. Yanukovych and his forces cracked down harshly on the protesters, which I believe was a major mistake, and the situation begins to escalate. On January 22nd, you have the first 2 deaths in the protests. On February 18th, it's about a month later, street clashes leave 26 dead. February 20th, street clashes leave 40 dead. Then on February 21st, this is very important, a number of foreign ministers from Europe, from Germany, Poland, and France, go to Ukraine and they work out a deal that will basically lead to early elections. And that will allow Yanukovych to leave office with face. Okay? In other words, by February 21st, it's clear to the Poles, the Americans, the Germans, and the French that Yanukovych is in deep trouble and that they have to get him out of there. So they cook up a deal on February 21st for early elections, all designed to get rid of Yanukovych. But the protesters reject the deal. Very important to understand this. The protesters reject the deal. And there is increased violence as the protesters occupy buildings, as shooting continues, and Yanukovych, fearing for his life, flees the country. And that's when the trouble begins. Key events after the coup. On February 23rd, this is the Ukrainian parliament. It votes to repeal minority language laws. Almost everybody agrees this was a huge mistake on the part of the new government or the new leadership in Kiev, because it greatly alienated the Russian speakers in the country, and there were many of them. Then on February 27th, Russian units begin seizing checkpoints in Crimea. It's very important, by the way, to understand that the Russians actually had sizable forces in Crimea because they had a lease for the naval base at Sevastopol. The Russians were allowed by treaty to have up to 25,000 troops in the Crimea. This is before the crisis broke out. So the Russians were already there. February 27, Russian units begin seizing checkpoints. February 28th, additional Russian forces, these are forces from Russia itself, begin moving into Crimea. March 6th, the Crimean parliament votes to join Russia and to hold a referendum, which is held on March 16th. You all know the results of the referendum. And on March 18th, Russia incorporates Crimea. You see what happened there? It all started with the association agreement in November of 2013. Conflict then broke out in the Maidan demonstrations, which led to the coup on February 22nd, which led to the Russians taking Crimea. Now, let's talk a little bit about the Russian response. What is it? I believe that the Russian response to the crisis is twofold. Number one, to take Crimea. I think that the Russians took Crimea largely for strategic reasons. I think that the Russians understood they had a naval base there. It was a strategically important piece of real estate on the Black Sea. It made really good sense from a Russian point of view to control that territory or to basically own that territory. And given that the majority of the population was in favor of joining Russia and leaving Ukraine, it was kind of a no-brainer. That's the first step that the Russians took. The second step is that they have gone to great lengths to basically tell the Ukrainians that they have two choices. One is they can cease and desist from trying to join the West, in which case the Russians will pretty much leave them alone, or Ukraine can continue to push for joining the West, in which case the Russians will go to great lengths to wreck Ukraine. And I believe that the Russians are in the process of wrecking Ukraine. And they're in the process of wrecking Ukraine because they don't want Ukraine to join NATO. They don't want Ukraine to join the West. Lots of people like to say that what the Russians have in Ukraine is a frozen conflict. I think to some extent it is a frozen conflict, but I think it's much more than a frozen conflict. I think the Russians are fully aware that as they tighten the vice on the Ukrainians, it's doing increasingly greater damage to the Ukrainian economy, which is in big trouble to begin with, and it's exacerbating those political cleavages that already exist in Ukraine and are a potential source of enormous trouble. So as long as the Russians are involved in eastern Ukraine, they're in a position where they can do really serious damage to the Ukrainian body politic. And the point I'm making to you is they are doing that because that is their way of signaling to Ukraine, you cannot become part of the West. That is unacceptable to us. So that's the basic policy of the Russians in the wake of what happened on February 22nd. The question is, what motivates it? What motivates it is that Ukraine is a core vital interest of Russia, as is Georgia, although I would argue that Ukraine is even more important. It is a large chunk of real estate right on Russia's border that separates it from Poland and Germany. It's a piece of real estate that the Russians cannot afford to allow the West to dominate. You want to understand here that NATO was a mortal foe of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And Russia is basically the replacement for the Soviet Union. The idea that Russia is going to tolerate a situation where NATO, with the United States in charge, marches right up to its border is simply unthinkable. This is not the way international politics works. Great powers care greatly about the security of their neighborhood. Great powers do not like for 1 second the idea of a distant great power marching up to their borders. Many of you probably don't know this, but in the Western Hemisphere, which the United States dominates, we have what's called the Monroe Doctrine. You know what the Monroe Doctrine basically says? It says, we own the Western Hemisphere, and no distant great power is allowed to move military forces into the Western Hemisphere. And heaven forbid, no distant great power is allowed to form a military alliance with a country in the Western Hemisphere. All of you are too young to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963, but the Soviet Union had the audacity to put missiles in Cuba. It drove the United States stark raving crazy. Who are these people to come into the Western Hemisphere? This is our neighborhood. Don't they know about the Monroe Doctrine? The Soviets are not allowed to put missiles in Cuba. And then after that, the Soviets talked about building a naval base at Cienfuegos in Cuba. The United States told the Soviets in no uncertain terms, that's unacceptable. We do not like other great powers on our borders. This is hardly surprising. This is Geopolitics 101. Well, I want to ask you, if the United States doesn't like great powers in its neighborhood, why should the Soviets or the Russians like great powers in its neighborhood? They shouldn't. It's hardly surprising. Hardly surprising. As my mother taught me when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And if we can have a Monroe Doctrine, and we don't want distant great powers in our backyard, why shouldn't the same logic apply to Russia? And of course it does apply to Russia. Was it surprising? The Russian response? Actually, the United States, President Obama in particular, and the Western leaders were caught completely off guard by what happened. It's really quite remarkable. They were completely surprised that the crisis broke out. This is after the Russians told the Western leaders on numerous occasions that it was unacceptable to try to move Ukraine and Georgia into the West's orbit. This is after you had a war in August of 2008 over Georgia. And we were still surprised. This is a world in which the United States has the Monroe Doctrine, and it has had it since 1823. And doesn't understand that moving NATO, the European Union, right up to Russia's doorsteps and promoting regime change in Ukraine and actually threatening regime change in Russia? I could go into that in the Q&A if anybody wants. We were threatening regime change in Russia as well. You don't think that's going to spook the Russians? Anybody who doesn't understand that doesn't understand Geopolitics 101. This brings me to the next point. Why was the West surprised? The West was surprised because the two sides were playing according to different playbooks. The United States was thinking about NATO expansion, EU expansion, in a fundamentally different way than the Russians were. The Russians had a very realist view of what was going on. The Russians were deeply concerned about their security, and they saw NATO expansion and EU expansion and the Orange Revolution as a threat to their survival, as a threat to their security. And they made that clear to the West. This is Geopolitics 101, as I've said on a number of occasions already. The West was not thinking in geopolitical terms. The point I'm going to make to you now is of enormous importance. You want to understand that the West was not moving toward Ukraine and toward Georgia for the purposes of containing Russia. There's no evidence that the Russians were thinking about taking Crimea back. Do you understand that? There's no evidence the Russians were thinking about taking Crimea back. There's no evidence that they were building the military forces to invade any country in Eastern Europe. In fact, when you look at the deployment of Russian forces in the western districts of Russia in February 2014, what's striking is how few military units are there and how incompetent they are. And all sorts of American policymakers will tell you that they told the Russians that NATO expansion was not directed at containing them. This was not a realist response. This was not the Cold War where NATO was built to contain the Soviet Union. We were not trying to contain Russia before February 22nd, 2014, when the crisis broke out, because there was no reason to try to contain Russia. Because there was, again, no evidence that Russia was thinking or acting in ways that looked like it was going to move westward. It's very important to understand that. The reason we were moving NATO eastward was we thought that we had this giant liberal security community in Western Europe that we needed to expand further and further. What we needed to do was spread democracy, spread our institutions, NATO and the EU, spread democracy, Orange Revolution, get these countries hooked on capitalism. That's what we were thinking. That's why we were shocked. That's why we in the West were shocked when this crisis broke out. John Kerry, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton have said that realism is an antiquated way of thinking about the world. It's what people thought in the 17th and 18th century. It's not what modern men and women think about. We live in a new world. This is the way they were thinking. And of course, Vladimir Putin and the Russians were thinking in completely different terms. And by the way, the Chinese think in the same terms that the Russians think. They act in a very realpolitik way. So the end result is you had these two sides acting according to different playbooks. That's why we were surprised. But again, my point is we should not have been surprised. All right, let's talk about the conventional wisdom. I've given you John's view on the causes of the crisis. Let's talk about the conventional wisdom. First, Vladimir Putin is the main cause. Second, some people hint that he's crazy or irrational. There have even been hints that he bears marked resemblance to Hitler. And then there's the argument that he's bent on creating a greater Russia. Let me say a little bit about each of these. First of all, Putin is not the main cause. The West is the main cause. I want to see somebody provide the evidence that shows that Putin was driving the train before February 22nd, 2014. The idea that he's crazy or irrational, in fact, he's behaved in a very strategic fashion. He's behaved very rationally. I think there's no evidence that he's behaved in a foolish way. Many people argued at the start of the crisis that he was acting foolishly, and the evidence of that is that he'd ultimately end up with egg all over his face, that Russian policy would fail. Now, if anything, people are irate that Putin has been so successful at dealing with the West over the Ukraine crisis. So I think the argument that he's irrational or crazy cannot be supported by any evidence. The argument that he bears marked resemblance or even some small resemblance to Hitler is laughable, right? It's a laughable argument. Anybody who makes that argument knows nothing about Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was one of the greatest mass murderers of all time. Vladimir Putin bears zero resemblance to Adolf Hitler. The argument that he's bent on creating a greater Russia, remember, as I said to you before, there is no evidence that he was doing any such thing or thinking about doing any such thing before February 22nd, 2014. That was a story that we invented That was a story we invented after the crisis broke out. Furthermore, he does not have the capability to conquer huge chunks of territory in Eastern Europe and reestablish the former Soviet Union or create a greater Russia. Russia is a declining great power. It does not have that much military might. This is a country that has a smaller gross national product than Italy. The idea that Russia is the second coming of the Soviet Union and has enough armored division equivalents to overrun Eastern Europe is laughable. So what I'm telling you here is, not only is there no evidence that Putin was bent on creating a greater Russia, he can't do it. In fact, if you want to do anything to wreck Russia today, what you should do is encourage it to invade Ukraine. See how well that goes. You know how the United States is very good at invading countries, and then once the United States owns those countries, it runs into all sorts of problems. Soviets did this in Afghanistan. They had little trouble overrunning Afghanistan. Then once they owned it, everything went south. That's the same thing that would happen in Ukraine. The Russians could easily overrun Ukraine. But what would be the end result? They'd own it, and they'd be in a giant quagmire. Putin understands this for sure, and therefore he's not going to do it. I told you what Putin is doing in Ukraine. Causes of the conflict, conventional wisdom, second slide. Here we get the argument that the United States is a benign hegemon seeking to promote European stability, and Putin's behavior proves that it was wise to expand NATO eastward to try including Ukraine and Georgia. The argument that the United States is a benign hegemon is part of the liberal story. Again, when the United States moved NATO eastward, up toward Ukraine and Georgia, it believed that it was not threatening the Russians because it is run by a benign hegemon, the United States of America. It's a liberal hegemon. What we were doing was spreading this liberal security community eastward. And we were doing it in a very benign fashion. And that, of course, is why we were surprised. But again, from a Russian point of view, the United States does not look like a benign hegemon. I've had this argument with Michael McFaul, who is the ambassador to Russia between 2012 and 2014, where he says that when he was the ambassador, he talked to President Putin on a number of occasions and told him that NATO expansion was not designed to threaten Russia, and in fact that the Russians shouldn't worry about it at all. But of course, he said, when I asked him how Putin responded, that Putin rejected that argument. And McFaul tried on more than one occasion to convince Putin and his lieutenants that the United States was a benign force and that NATO expansion had benign intentions behind it. But he could not convince Putin of that. And of course, as you all understand, it's not what Mike McFaul or Barack Obama thinks that counts. What counts is what Vladimir Putin thinks and his lieutenants. And Putin and his lieutenants did not see the United States as a benign hegemon because they were not playing by the liberal playbook. They were playing by a realist playbook. Putin's behavior proves that it was wise to expand NATO eastward to try including Ukraine and Georgia. Again, there was no evidence that Putin or Russia needed to be contained. Let's switch gears now and talk about the West's response, at least so far. The West's response has been to double down. What we decided was that Putin had to be the bad guy, and we had to concoct a story that portrayed Russia as being principally responsible for this crisis. You understand, what I'm saying here is that the Americans caused the crisis. There's no way the United States and its European allies could admit that they caused the crisis. They couldn't admit that. They had to blame the Russians. So what they did was they concocted a story about Putin. That is the conventional wisdom, and that's what I'm trying to knock down. And again, what is the conventional wisdom today? The conventional wisdom is that Putin has highly aggressive intentions, he has substantial military forces, and what you're seeing in Ukraine is just the beginning. That's the conventional wisdom. And of course, once you start spinning that conventional wisdom, you have no choice but to double down. Move forces into Eastern Europe, make NATO stronger, have military exercise right in the Russians' faces. This is really great. Of course, we now have poisonous relations, which I'll talk more about in a minute. But the basic strategy of the West was to double down. And this is exactly what we should have expected, because there's no way we were going to blame ourselves for the crisis. Barack Obama wasn't going to say, geez, I goofed. I made a big mistake. He was going to say, no, Putin is highly aggressive. I believe the West is playing a losing hand. The idea that we're going to get the Russians to throw up their hands and quit and allow us to incorporate Ukraine and Georgia into NATO or into the West more generally is a pipe dream. Here's the basic reason why. Ukraine is a core strategic interest for Russia. It's a vital strategic interest. Ukraine is not a core strategic interest for the United States or for the West more generally. When the crisis broke out and the Russians became involved in eastern Ukraine, the United States was unwilling to go to war over Ukraine. In August 2008, the United States was unwilling to go to war over Georgia. What that says is that for the United States, neither Georgia nor Ukraine are vital strategic interests. For Russia, those two countries are vital strategic interests. That means that the balance of resolve in a crisis like the one we have now favors the Russians over the Americans by a large margin. That's another way of saying you can inflict massive punishment on Russia and the Russians will not throw up their hands. The reason the Russians will not throw up their hands is that Ukraine is a vital strategic interest. And the idea that they would allow the West to take Ukraine and integrate it into the Western orbit and pull it away from Russia is just not going to happen. So we in the West can inflict as much pain as we want on the Russians, and I believe it won't matter. The Russians will absorb the pain because you're dealing with a vital strategic interest. Let's assume that I'm wrong. Let's assume that we're successful. Let's assume that the West backs the Russians into a corner, that Putin is desperate. Is this good? You think it's good to take a great power that has thousands of nuclear weapons and back it into a corner? You think it's really good to make the Russians scared? You think you want to threaten their security in a profound way? You think you want to threaten their survival? I don't. I think you want to be really careful. I think what's really amazing here is that Ukraine and Georgia are not vital strategic interests for the United States. They're not core strategic interests. Yet we're willing to get really rough with the Russians. I think it's a very dangerous game. But again, my point is we're playing a losing hand. So I don't think we're going to reach the juncture where the Russians are desperate. But if I'm wrong and the Russians are desperate and they have nuclear weapons, I'd be very, very nervous. Let me conclude with some comments about what should be done. My view, as many of you know, is that the central aim should be to create a neutral Ukraine, which is a buffer state between NATO and Russia. A lot of people say, this would never work, how could you do this? I point out to people that between 1992 and 2014, Ukraine was basically neutral, and it was a buffer state. There was no problem over Ukraine in the year 2000. Just go back to the year 2000. What did Ukraine look like? Was Ukraine part of the West? No. In 2000, was Ukraine part of the Russian security alliance? No. It was basically a neutral state. It was a buffer state between NATO and Russia. So you can imagine doing that again. Remember my little chart that I began with? How to think about European security. There's NATO, France, Germany, and Poland. There's Ukraine, there's Russia. This is the situation that you want. You want Ukraine as a neutral buffer state. This is the situation you don't want. Russia has eastern Ukraine, NATO has western Ukraine. They're eyeball to eyeball on the Dnieper River. This would not be good. This would not be good, right? Much better to have a neutral Ukraine. What specifically should be done? Explicitly abandon NATO expansion. Most people will tell you that NATO expansion is off the table. Not going to happen. But the West can't admit that publicly. It would be very helpful if the West explicitly abandoned NATO expansion. Second, fashion an economic rescue plan for Ukraine with Russia, the IMF, and the EU. Remember what I told you early on. I told you that Putin approached the EU in 2015 and made it clear that it was not adamantly opposed to the association agreement, but that it, Russia, wanted to work with the EU to make sure Russia's interests were protected. Bring the Americans in, bring the IMF in, and the EU, and the Russians, and the Ukrainians, and you can fashion a plan to resuscitate the Ukrainian economy. You all understand that Russia has a vested interest in an economically viable Ukraine. Russia does not have an interest in seeing the Ukrainian economy implode because Russia has deep-seated economic interests in Ukraine. And if Ukraine flourished, that would be good for Russia. So as long as Ukraine is a neutral state, not in NATO, you can do all sorts of things on the economic front that would be good for Ukraine, good for Russia, good for the EU. Third, you want to guarantee minority rights, especially language rights in Ukraine. Remember, I told you one of the most foolish things that the new government did, or parliament did in Ukraine right after the coup, was basically outlaw speaking of the Russian language. Huge mistake. And then finally, the Donbass region is going to have to be given meaningful autonomy. This is the way out. There's no other alternative. Okay, consequences. Will there be a new Cold War? What are the implications for NATO? What are the implications for Syria? Is Crimea lost to Russia for good? And what are the implications for Ukraine? Will there be a new Cold War? No. Notice that I'm using Cold War with a capital C and a capital W. The Cold War was an intense security competition between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is gone. The United States is the lone superpower on the planet. I believe that Russia is reemerging as a great power, and I believe that China is probably the second most powerful state in the system at this point in time. And I believe you now have three great powers, China, Russia, and the United States. And in that context, it's hard to see what's happening as a new Cold War, right? Soviet Union is gone. Furthermore, the Russia that has replaced the Soviet Union, as I said before, does not have a lot of offensive military capability. Soviet Union had a lot of offensive military capability. It was a formidable military force, certainly for the first 2/3, 3/4 of the Cold War. Russia does not have that kind of capability and is not likely to have it over the foreseeable future. So I believe you may have a Cold War with a little c and a little w between Russia and the United States, but you're not going to have anything approximating the first Cold War. What are the implications for NATO? Actually, this crisis has given NATO a new life. You all understand that the United States, starting in 2011, was talking about pivoting to Asia. And as I like to say, when you pivot to Asia, that means you're pivoting away from another place. The place we were pivoting away from was Europe. And the Europeans, before 2014, were desperately afraid that we were going to leave them in the lurch. They did not want the American military to completely leave Europe. Well, now, if anything, the American commitment to Europe has been strengthened because of the Ukraine crisis and because the Americans see the need to double down, which means moving NATO military capabilities further east than has ever been the case before. So in a very important way, NATO has been given a new life by this crisis. But the pivot to Asia has been threatened by this crisis. What are the implications for Syria? I think quite significant. I think that for the Syrian crisis to be shut down, it's absolutely essential that the United States and the Russians work together. I think it's almost impossible for the Americans to work with the Syrians because we have poisonous relations, and the principal reason that we have poisonous relations is the Ukraine crisis. I think what you see going on with regard to US-Russian relations over Syria is spillover from the Ukraine crisis. So I think for Syria, the Ukraine crisis has had really negative consequences. Is Crimea lost to Russia for good? I'll answer this question with one word: yes. What are the implications for Ukraine? This is a very important question. I want to elaborate on this. As I told you before, what's happening here is that Ukraine continues to be interested in joining the West. Ukraine would like to become part of NATO, would like to become part of the EU, would like to become part of the West. This is an absolute no-no for the Russians. And the way the Russians are trying to prevent it is by going to great lengths to wreck Ukraine. They're trying to wreck Ukraine not because they want to conquer Ukraine or because the Russians are naturally aggressive. They're trying to wreck Ukraine because they want to prevent it from becoming part of the West. Some evidence of that. Here's Ukrainian per capita GDP. 2013, $3,900. $3,900. 2015, $1,600. Overall, Ukrainian GDP shrunk by 6.8% in 2014. Remember, the crisis breaks out February 22nd, 2014. Overall, Ukrainian GDP shrinks by 6.8% in 2014. It shrunk by 15% in 2015. If you do some Googling and you look at what's happening to the Ukrainian economy today, it's quite clear that it's in free fall. It's quite clear that this is having all sorts of negative consequences for Ukraine. Who is anti-Ukrainian? I've given this talk a number of times. And in fact, when I gave it at Chatham House, I was involved in a debate involving Michael McFaul, Roger Cohen of the New York Times, Dmitry Trenin from here. There were a number of Ukrainian women, 3 Ukrainian women in the audience who listened to the talk, listened to the debate. And indeed, one of them asked me a question from the floor. But afterwards, we had a reception at Chatham House. And these 3 women, again, all Ukrainian, came up to me. And it was clear that they were enraged by my comments. And I, of course, was making a set of arguments that bear marked resemblance to what I've said here tonight. They were just enraged by what I said. And their view was that I was deeply hostile to Ukraine. And they could not understand why I hated Ukraine. And I told them I thought that they were dead wrong. I said, in no way am I anti-Ukrainian. I said, my argument is that it is the West that has led Ukraine down the primrose path. It's the West that told Ukraine and told Georgia that they should become part of NATO, they should become part of the EU, and that caused this crisis. And that the West continues to hint, if not occasionally tell the Ukrainians that they can become part of the West. This is delusional because they can't become part of the West. The Russians will go to great lengths for good strategic reasons to wreck Ukraine before they let that happen. And I just showed you the figures that provide some evidence that that's exactly what's happening here. So what needs to be done is Ukraine needs to stop talking and thinking about joining the West and instead move to create a neutral buffer state and move to improve its relations with the Russians for Ukraine's own good. Ukraine needs to stop listening to the United States because the United States, again, and its European allies are principally responsible for causing this mess and exacerbating this mess. And the idea that someone like me is anti-Ukrainian is fundamentally wrong. I'm not anti-Ukrainian, and the best way to solve this problem for the Ukrainian people is to adopt the policy that I laid out here and to abandon the present policy that they're pursuing, largely egged on by the West. What are the prospects for ending this crisis? I'd say, given how poisoned relations are between Russia and the West, and given the present situation in Ukraine itself, the prospects for ending the crisis are somewhere between bleak and hopeless. Thank you.